Hello and welcome to MySecTV and our Tech and Sec Weekly. My name's Chris Covage. I'm the editor with MySecurity Media, and this is our Friday morning episode. This morning we're going to be joined by Lani, Refiti, who is the Regional Director with Claroty, and we're going to be talking about IoT and OT security vulnerabilities and some of the recent research that Claroty has been doing. And then we're going to cross to Melbourne, I hope, and with Monash University and Professor Jude, McCulloch, who is with the Faculty of Arts in Criminology. And we're going to look at the Chauvin trial and the outcomes and impacts on policing. And this is obviously to do with the murder of George Flloyd in the US, but it has obviously had ramifications around the world. So quite contrasting subjects this morning, but both very interesting. We cover off on aerospace and space, defence and national security, cybersecurity and critical technology, and cities and infrastructure. We should be streaming, and I'm just trusting it this morning, on LinkedIn, YouTube, and on Facebook. Our main Facebook channel is the Asia Pacific Security Magazine, and our cybersecurity subjects get put out on our podcast, the Cybersecurity Weekly podcast. We will go for the full 60 minutes, I imagine, this morning. And if you've got any questions or want to press like and share it out to your colleagues, please do. Let us know where you're listening from. And and any comments or questions you've got, particularly say of Lani as well on IoT security. I'm sure will grab his expertise while it's available. We had Drago, I'm going to say his name properly now, Vozdanovic. I've been practicing. Drago is the CEO of Sintira, and they've just done a nice contract with the DTA on their secure internet gateway. And that was a good interview. If you're looking at cloud networking, cloud computing, Drago and his team are definitely leading in that space in terms of the range of secure internet gateways that they can put together. And also on cloud computing and cloud networking, we crossed last week with Amir Khan, the president, CEO, and founder of Alkira, and they on the sort of transformation journey to Azure, and they're part of the Microsoft for Startups program as well. He's in San Jose. And then we crossed also last week to Canberra, and Air Vice Marshal John Blackburn AO retired, and the launch of the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group, and the pretty much the lack of leadership at federal government level on our national security strategy or a national resilience strategy. And again, quite good insights from John and his team, worth having a look, and you'll hear more from them also. We've just concluded our SCADA and ICS cybersecurity course, and I highlight this because we're going to be talking with Lani on this subject. But this course is now available on demand on learnsecurity.mysecuritymarketplace.com. Check that out. It's our new platform. We'll officially launch it over the next few weeks, but that course is now available on demand. And also still promoting our top women in security ASEAN region. So if you know women in security within the 10 nations of ASEAN, please encourage them to get involved and nominate. We've just hit 50 nominations for that, and nominations close 30th of May. Just highlighting our Cybersecurity Weekly podcast, there from Jane Lowe, our Singapore correspondent as well, and our recent MySecTV interview with Chris Althus is there, and a range of other recent episodes. Check out the Cyber Risk Leaders magazine and the 20 articles in there. And thank you to our sponsors, RSA and the RSA Secure ID Suite, and ALC and their cybersecurity certification courses are also available pretty much on most of our channels in terms of a link through. If you want to support the channel and MySecTV, go to mysectv.shop. We've got our Cyber War series. I've got my Indian tiger on today. And you can check out a range of other sort of cybersecurity merchandise. So that's it from the marketplace and from me. And without further ado, I'm going to bring on Lani Refiti, the Regional Director with Claroty up there in sunny Queensland. Lani, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks, Chris, and thanks for inviting me on. I'm an avid follower of the show, and I think the more interesting topic is the one you've got to follow with the Chauvin trial. I'll make sure to watch it. That'll be really interesting.
Yeah, and no offense, a few people have said that. Oh, that might be interesting as well. So, but look, you can't get past IoT security in our industrial revolution that we are, 4.0. And Claroty, and this interview's kind of come around with Claroty. I'll get regular sort of media releases from Claroty on their recent research and the like, and there's a range of vulnerabilities, and they're always in that OT sort of space. Maybe let's start with your role as regional director. You're kind of new in the seat there, and Claroty is also a very specialised sort of cybersecurity company as well. So, Lani, your new role as regional director with Claroty and how you're enjoying it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, look, newish role since the beginning of this year, running the Claroty business here in Australia and New Zealand. So we are a startup that came out of Israel and now headquartered in the US, and we've been in the ANZ region for the last few years. We're a small team of about 11 people here, with a few more to come, and that's across the range of customer-facing channels development, as well as professional services engineers, support engineers as well, on both the east and west coast. And like you said, our focus is purely on the industrial space. So industries that are heavily reliant on operational technology, industrial control systems, and the sort of the emerging industrial IoT movement, right? And that convergence of the traditional IT environments and OT, which is happening, albeit probably not as fast as the Gartners and McKinseys of the world would like you to believe, but it is occurring, especially in the data space, where a lot of organizations are looking to match their historian data, which usually sits within OT environments, with on Azure or on GCP, etc.
And I suppose that is one of the key ones that I'd like to touch on, is that cloud computing and the analytics that are going on in sort of cloud environments, but they are actually feeding data from operational technology and the like. How advanced do you think it is? Do you think it's happening in pockets or industry sectors? What's your observations in that?
Yeah, good point there. Industry sectors, I think the power and the water sector, manufacturing sectors are probably the most mature in that aspect of that. It's a marketing term, but we'll use it in terms of that convergence, right? And what you mentioned around analytics, that's where it's beginning, the data. So, and most of the platforms, customers aren't building in their data centers. They're now using, the off-the-shelf, from Azure, GCP, or AWS. And what's happening is that you're right. They're dragging or pulling data from their OT networks, but it is at the top level of the OT network. So if you look at your operational technology network and break it down using the Purdue model, which is sort of the logical communication representation for OT networks that is most popularly used. Think of it as like the OSI stack for corporate IT. The top layer of the Purdue model, level 4 or up to level 5, is that corporate IT. So usually they place they pull the data from lower level historian or etc. databases, and then they move that data into their corporate IT, into the cloud. So it's still done in a segmented fashion, secure, if you want to call it that fashion. But that's where it's starting. And obviously, as industrial IoT takes hold and continues, you will see a lot more communication into your OT networks that sort of break that Purdue model and either come in directly or into certain layers of that model.
It's making sure that it's at, what's the term, omnidirectional. So it's that data only coming out. There's no data going in or accessing in. And that's kind of the key aspect.
Correct.
Maybe talk us through some of the vulnerabilities that have come out. And there's quite a few, actually. I just do a Claroty search in my email, and all of the releases come up. And, you've got a good PR team, I'll give you that much, in terms of just pumping out. So we've had a Schneider electric smart meter exploit or vulnerability, Rockwell's FactoryTalk asset center, Ovarro's TBox remote terminal units, and then generally just the OPC and OPC's open something communications.
Platform communication, open platform communication. So it's it's a library protocol that sort of that takes, if you look at sort of proprietary devices, let's say a Rockwell automations pump connected to a Schneider electric sensor, so to speak. It takes those two proprietary protocols and allows communication between both, and then upstream to your HMI, which is a human machine interface.
Yeah.
So it's the glue that sort of holds all that together. And the thing with OPC is that it's widely used. And often companies will build their libraries into third-party products, and so you might have a Rockwell Automations PLC, but part of that will be that OPC stack So the challenge with that, it makes it a little bit harder to update in terms of patching it, or if there's a firmware vulnerability, etc.
And the other one is that remote access to PLCs as well that are coming through. What are you seeing sort of front line there in terms of PLCs and new PLCs coming to market? Do they have new security features, things like mandatory password change from the default and that type of thing?
They are starting to, yeah. But the challenge with a lot of these PLCs is their lifespan, right? They're 10 years, sometimes more, in terms of, and the PLCs these days, which is a programmable logic card, it's what programs the actual pumps, the sensors, etc., the physical layer. The challenge to PLCs these days is they're becoming much more modular. So traditionally, PLCs will communicate in very specific protocols, non-TCP/IP, non-Ethernet type protocols, right? Like Modbus, DNP3, Profibus, right? Which is makes it harder for an attacker to navigate, because you require sort of specialized knowledge of it. But PLCs these days are becoming modular, so it's not uncommon for a PLC to have 3 or 4 modules in their rack slot, and one of those modules being an Ethernet slot, which communicates over TCP, right? So it makes it easier, makes it more visible on networks, etc. So they are doing more things. Like I've seen some PLCs that are connected to HMIs that have a web interface, right? And they're exposed to the internet. It's like, well, goodness, and these things control, pumps at, sewage, water plants, etc. So, and a lot of these organizations have long relied on security by obscurity, in terms of and they're not going to find it. But if you've used if you've got cursory sort of skills in Shodan, you'll find it. Someone will find it.
And Shodan, we had Cato Networks sort of highlighted Shodan, and it's something again Dan Eyright raises as well as Shodan. I haven't played a lot in Shodan. I'm almost scared too of what I'm going to find, but it's on my to-do list just recently. But even sort of I'm in an apartment building, and just getting a sense of what might be in a building. So it's on one of those things in terms of time, making the time for research. But anyone listening, check out the Shodan site and start playing around with that and seeing what you can come up with. It's a good way to do your own vulnerability assessments as well. Maybe the contrast with physical security too, Lani, in terms of the IT OT mix and the importance of physical security. Do you think that's underrated, or underappreciated at times, or do you think it is a dominant part of OT security?
Again, it depends on industry verticals, and it depends on clients, right? And I'll give an example. In the building space, the smart buildings, etc. Some buildings are extremely porous in terms of, we in a previous life we would do like a cybersecurity audit or some sort of red teaming exercise on a building, and it would be really easy just to walk into the server room, right, rather than trying to entry point via wireless or entry point via a digital wayfinder, etc. You just buy yourself a high-vis shirt and try and walk straight into the server room, and you can connect straight into the the aggregation switch. So the physical security in some industries, particularly in the building space, is still very porous. And as I said, it makes a complete mockery of the whole security model.
Look,
but
in some sorry, go.
Yeah, I was going to say, but in some organizations, like we a couple of years ago, we ran a red teaming exercise for a power distribution company, and it took a lot of work to finally get into the control room, and a couple of our people were actually pulled up, and police called in our attempts to try and get in there. So in those kind of industries, regulated industries, physical security is taken very seriously, obviously.
Yeah, I was going to say, I absolutely agree. I do probably more building security related work, and the comms rooms are often unlocked. The racks are open, they're not locked, apart from the cabling. Great. That's the only sort of security aspect that they have, is the cabling's a complete mess, so you wouldn't know where to start in the first place. But from a wireless aspect, and as you say, the critical infrastructure, that does bring us to critical infrastructure and what's happening here in Australia at least, but elsewhere. This has happened in Singapore, and I know Claroty's up in Singapore as well. You've got an office up there, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, that's where our Asia Pacific headquarters are based.
Yeah, so critical infrastructure, what are you seeing in terms of what's happening here in Australia in terms of critical infrastructure under the new Australian cybersecurity strategy and what's been rolled out from the Australian Cybersecurity Centre and AEST? There's a program now on sort of auditing and reviewing critical infrastructure cybersecurity.
Yes, yeah. Well, the actual act, which is the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, is being amended at the moment. It's going through their their co-design process, which is actually, it's been pretty good. I mean, I went through the APRA sort of cybersecurity act, the AEMO one for energy, power, etc. This is good in terms of the collaboration and consultation that they've had with industry. I mean, you'll still get people complaining that they didn't listen or they didn't do this, didn't do that, but the process they went through and the iterations that they came back through clearly showed that they were listening. And yeah, so the act itself is being amended, and the good thing is that it puts a lot more onus on operators of those assets, etc., to ensure that they have a good security posture. They have a that's provable, via audits, etc. Expanding the scope of what's actually covered. So what I'm seeing from customers in critical infrastructure is a lot more work going into cyber in terms of and good work in the sense that it's not just going out and buying something like Claroty to tick a box, right? It's actually a programmatic, based on if they're power, they're usually looking at the AEST, which is the cybersecurity framework from the regular AEMO. If they're water, they're usually relying on a more of an industry standard, but they're actually following a programmatic step, looking at their governance, risk processes first, and then ending up with technology to sort of mitigate some of those risks.
What do you how do you approach an audit or an assessment? Do you look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework? Do you work to a particular standard? What's your preferred sort of standard that you would work to?
Yeah, and again, it's industry specific, and there's a number of really good broad standards as well. The NIST standard is very good. If it's in power, generation, transmission, distribution, then the default is AEMO as the regulator, their new standard that they've released. If not, as I said, NIST, IEC 62443 is another good one to use. And as a former consultant in my consulting, a good framework is always a good use. Kind of thing. So I would always rely on one of those.
Nice. Now, maybe just talk us as we finish off, and Jude will join us very shortly. Recent research that Claroty has come through. You've been briefed by your analyst team. What's some of the recent findings that you've had, and maybe some call to actions for those involved?
Look, probably the most severe one, and I should take care when I talk about it, because a lot of these are with our partners and investors, right?
Fair enough.
So, and these are, and what I'll say is these are public, right? So we've worked, typical research. We've worked with the manufacturer in terms of disclosing up front first, and work with them to actually write patches, etc. for that. And then when they're happy with it, then we've released disclosure. So responsible disclosure at all times. Probably the one that sort of took my attention was the Rockwell Automation's FactoryTalk Asset Center one.
Yeah.
And the reason being is that if you know anything about OT environments, Rockwell Automation is probably one of the two big manufacturers globally, along with Honeywell. And this solution that they've got is basically, think of it as the brains of an OT system, right? What it does is it oversees the backup and disaster recovery services, version controls, source controls, asset inventory, etc., of an OT environment. So it's the brains. It's got everything, right? It allows you to do what we call project file backup. So a PLC or an RTU will have backup files you need in order to reflash firmware, or bring it back up if it's corrupted, etc. So 9 vulnerabilities. Our research team found 9 vulnerabilities in this solution, which if exploited, could give you access to the entire facility, factory, whatever it was that this was controlling. And the big thing about this was a potential exploit of it. Again, if we use the Purdue model, and the way customers usually use the Purdue model is that every layer is segmented, is completely segmented off from the next layer. And some of the layers, depending on the industries, will use things like data diodes, which force or guarantee one-way communication, so hard segmentation of each layer. But if you were able to exploit one of these 9 exploits on this specific solution from Rockwell, it basically broke the security model, because this asset center had access to the different layers of the Purdue model. So it was quite alarming. But again, responsible disclosure, Rockwell were able to quickly release patches for that before we disclose the vulnerabilities. But yeah, that probably over the last 6 months of the many that we've sort of disclosed, that probably was the big one.
Yeah, and that affects FactoryTalk Asset Center version 10 and earlier. I've just put the link out on at least YouTube and a few of the Facebook channels. In terms, that's on the our Cyber Risk Leaders website, that particular release, and that's CVEs 27462 and in that range. So again, as Lani mentioned, there's 9, and I suppose the research process that's kind of the fun part. Have you done that part in terms of they basically get these units and the like, and then break them and just attack them, really? But to get 9, and it's they've termed them as a class of bugs that occur when an attacker is able to inject malicious code into a serialized object that would be executed later when being deserialized. So I suppose once they're in, then they can sort of see what other vulnerabilities are there, and then really go through that process.
The really dangerous ones are the ones where they can remote exploit or remote exploitation of code. A lot of the vulnerability you see will allow an attacker to maybe restart the device, or launch some sort of denial of service, which for critical infrastructure is disastrous, could be disastrous, right? But this particular one allows a user to remotely execute code on the device, which means, as you said, right, it allows to give them control and potentially move laterally in the environment, maintain persistence, maybe even delete logs, etc., to obfuscate what they're doing.
Okay, well, look, maybe to finish off the risk assessment, and we're obviously talking industry specific as well. But how serious do you think this can get? We've had recently, I think, a hospital got breached and resulted in the death of somebody, and so cyber incidents do have impacts on physical safety. And some of the key sort of events that have been happening recently, the Florida water system or water treatment plant was the most recent one, but there's been some others in terms of the attack in Israel just recently, although that was an explosion, but still kind of we're classing that as a cyber attack. How common do you think these are, and then the risk profile of OT security, and maybe what our expectations should be into the future with critical infrastructure and the vulnerabilities there?
Yeah, look, that's an interesting discussion, right? Because I after being in the industry for 24 years in terms of security, I think we need to not go into hype and marketing around these things, and sort of give a factual sort of response. And if you look at it, attacks in OT and attacks in critical infrastructure are still rare, right? Compared to what's happening in IT, they are rare. But the challenge is they call them like black swan events, where it has low frequency but very high impact. Because they are critical infrastructure, they have very high impact. So, which is probably why you see so much in the news when, as you said, the Florida water plant, Oldsmar attack, etc. Again, you don't hear that very often. You don't hear about it in Australia, etc. But one sort of incident could have disastrous sort of effects. So I suppose it is a high risk.
Yeah, but it comes back. Do you think it then starts to play into national security, particularly when we have a heightened geopolitical situation and we're dealing with nation-state actors? That's where the game changes a little bit. And
exactly. So when you do it,
go, Lani.
When you do a typical risk assessment, right, all those factors go into to tell whether you have a heightened sense of risk, etc. And you're exactly right. The fact that there is a big geopolitical play, and we are right sort of on the edges of it here in Australia, and our big neighbor to in Southeast Asia, etc. That sort of heightens it, and I think those factors, not the fact that it's frequently happening and etc., but those factors make it an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, the other one I had, I've just lost it, but maybe just to close. What does Claroty actually do? And no need for a sales pitch, but what's the although if you're trained enough, go for it. But yeah, what's maybe just close off on what Claroty actually does or is, and other than the services, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I'll put a QR code up on the screen. I take credit card as well. So, no, look, Claroty is an industrial cybersecurity company. We don't do anything else. We only work in industries that have heavy reliance on OT, industrial computer systems. We provide a few solutions to detect potential anomalies and attackers in your environment. Provide that secure remote connection, and also soon to come, more of an endpoint based, if you want to call it that, solution that sits on engineering workstations and detects what's happening around them as well. So we're purely OT, don't do anything else, and also obviously moving into the new industrial IoT as it comes on more and more.
Nice. Well, you've got a big surface or landscape to cover, so very interesting as well. And I imagine you're national here in Australia. You mentioned you've got 11 people. Are you spread everywhere or just the East Coast?
Yes. Yeah. No, East and West Coast. Probably the bulk in the West Coast.
Oh, in the West Coast, in Perth?
Yes, in WA.
Nice. Okay. Well, that's the IoT state considered with their mining and resources. So very good. Well, look, Lani Refiti, the Regional Director with Claroty, thank you very much for this morning. And this will go out as a podcast as well, given it's on cybersecurity and OT. So thank you, Lani. I'll let you go and enjoy your day. And
thanks, Chris.
Yeah, pleasure having you on. And we'll have you on again later in the year.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Good man. Thank you. I'll let you go. And I'll put you backstage. Thanks, Lani. Okay, very interesting. And again, I've mentioned our SCADA, without me sounding like I'm doing a sales pitch, but our SCADA and ICS cybersecurity course with Daniel Ehrenreich is available on learnsecurity.mysecuritymarketplace.com, so you can check that out. Now, let me just sort my slides here. Now, complete change of tack, and we're going to be joined by Jude McCulloch, the Emeritus Professor in Criminology with the Faculty of Arts with Monash University. Jude, pleasure to have you on.
Pleasure to be here, Chris.
Great, good audio check too. We haven't done a pre-interview discussion, so we're going to get straight into it.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and I suppose, what's your initial take on the whole circumstance, and maybe a little bit more, maybe introduce yourself to the audience, I think, first in terms of being a criminologist, and I had a little bit of research on you, so you quite focus on policing as well. Yeah, what's your initial take and background into this this particular issue?
Yes, as you said, I'm a criminologist, and prior to about 20 years in academia, I worked as a community lawyer, and a focus of my work when I worked in community legal centres was on police brutality and violence, and ultimately the use of lethal force by police. Some people might remember that in the mid-1990s, early to mid-1990s, there was a spate fatal shootings by Victoria Police, and I was involved with a campaign that was run by Flemington Kensington Legal Service and the Uniting Church to look into the circumstances of those shootings. There was a feeling that Victoria Police were living by the culture of the gun and that people were being unnecessarily shot. That actually led to the initial academic career that I had. I looked at the circumstances behind police use of lethal force and found there was a trend towards militarisation, greater integration of the police and military, their philosophy, tactics and training, and weapons and hardware into policing, and that was part of the explanation. So that's what's kept me interested
busy
in policing, and particularly the use of brute force, brutality, excessive force, however you want to call it, police fatal shootings and lethal killings or killings by police.
with just my background, I was policing 1990 to 2005 in Western Australia, and I remember those days very well. Particularly, even nationally, policing were like, "What's going on in Victoria?" And I suppose that's the difference now. So leaving 2005 and looking at it in 2020 and what's happening in the US, do you think obviously it's focused on culture? I mean, where do you think the link is? Maybe we'll start with that in terms of a police organisation, how they treat and deal and interact with the community, and then how they interact with themselves. How linked do you think this is to culture and leadership versus then the accoutrements that they have in terms of tasers and other force options that they have? What are your thoughts about, I know it's a bigger picture there, but where do you think the key aspect that we would focus on if we want to make a change in the way that the police deal with the community and violence?
I think that's a really good question. And thinking about militarisation of police can be seen most obviously when they use military type hardware in their operations, and it can be from tanks to automatic weapons, and when they use extremely high levels of force, tactics that are focused on overwhelming force rather than minimum force. But really militarisation, that's the visible part of militarisation. We often see that, for example, when police are dealing with protesters, particularly the research says progressive protesters and protests involving a lot of minority community people. But the real heart of militarisation is a philosophy, and that philosophy is that you don't approach people as suspects who might have committed a crime but are nevertheless citizens entitled to due process, but you approach people, and particularly people from minority communities, as enemies within, who you use or are entitled to use overwhelming force against with impunity. And I think that is actually the heart of it. So you talk about culture. So in America, there's this saying, the thin blue line. It came from a film, I think, originally, but is something that's quite popularised, this idea that there's this thin line of police between chaos and protection or safety. But that phrase has increasingly become embroiled with notions of white supremacy. And that is because that line is most deeply etched in race. So if you're black or brown, African American, or a coloured person, or a person of colour in America, you're far more likely to be dealt with as an individual and as communities as the enemy within. And you see that reflected statistically, for example, and this is partly why the phrase Black Lives Matter has taken off, exploded since 2013, is African Americans are 13% of the population, but they're 2.5 times more likely to be killed by police. And really differential uses of force and lethal force by police officers. And of course, this is behind the global phenomena of Derek Chauvin, who killed African-American man George Flloyd by kneeling on his neck for nearly 10 minutes in public, in broad daylight. And as President Joe Biden said, we're not really talking about just one act of individual brutality, violence and murder by a police officer. We're looking at systemic racism in policing, and that's why it's an issue in the US. But why it's a global issue is because formerly enslaved people, First Nations people in settler countries like Australia, they recognise the symbology and the reality of this that has taken place through the generations.
I think it would be would be nice to see if it was just in the US, but as you just said, this is around the world, and really here in our own backyard, as you point out, here in Australia. And deaths in custody is being highlighted again now, following the Royal Commission 20 years ago, and we're still seeing deaths in custody. That's often not even involving violence; they're just in the system already. So this goes back. Do you have an answer? I suppose maybe that's a good question. Because it's easy to make the observations, and everyone knows, everyone can see it. Whether they recognize or whether they want to acknowledge it is a different thing. But it's visibly there across Australia in particular, but obviously in the US. But nothing changes, and it's like, is it because there is no answer, that this is going to be a slow burn, that we have to just make those long, difficult choices for long-term generational change? Or, and I touched on it in my introduction, we did an interview with, on climate change with former defence leaders last week, and they're saying there's just a lack of leadership, a lack of government leadership. Do you think there's a divide there between the states have to have that responsibility for policing, and then they're all doing their own thing? You have a Federal Royal Commission that can't implement it because the states won't do it, or the states won't change. Do you have an answer? Where do you think? I mean, I did focus on cultural, but then you brought up the militarisation of police. That changes the culture. How can you change the culture to non-violence when you're giving them semi-automatic weapons and armoury, and then telling them to go out in the street? You can't say go out and be gentle with a semi-automatic rifle. Yeah.
I think you make a lot of good points, and starting with the kind of connection between where we are now in Australia and events in the US. After George Floyd was killed in May 2020, murdered in broad daylight for everyone to see because there was a video, there were Black Lives Matter protests all around the world, including Australia. There were tens of thousands of people marched, and some had placards that said, "Different soil, same story." So that same story is police racism, systemic. And that racism doesn't come out of nowhere. It reflects the broader culture, but it also reinforces the broader culture, because when Indigenous or First Nations or Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people are over-policed, they're reproduced as criminals in the public imagination. So, and you talked about 30 years since the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody made more than 300 recommendations. They were looking at 99 deaths in custody when they brought out their report in 1991. Since then, there's been nearly 500 deaths in custody. And this is, as you said, some of them are deaths in that they weren't murdered. But I think we need to say killings / deaths, because there was violence in some of those incidents, there's no doubt. And in a system where police and corrections officers were held accountable, there would be people charged in relation to those events. What we've got to understand about George Floyd and the Chauvin trial and the guilty verdict, found guilty on 3 counts. So he committed a murder. We all saw that, and he was found guilty of murder. But impunity is the general rule, and a lot of people talk about how the Chauvin verdict of guilty was like a unicorn event. So many things had to come together to get that guilty verdict. The most perhaps compelling part of it is there were 8 witnesses, and there was that videotape that everyone saw. Got to remember, when people might not know this, but after George Floyd was murdered, the police department in Minneapolis put out a media release saying that a man had a medical event while being taken into custody. The police called for medical assistance, but unfortunately he died. So unless that videotape existed, we would never say that George Floyd was murdered. We wouldn't even say he was killed. We would say he died. So
well, it even comes down to those tactics of why he was laying on his neck you're trained, police are trained, and this is where it touches into the security sector as well, of asphyxiation and just laying someone down. We were trained not to do that and to be aware that that is happening. So there was a degree of intent that you saw in that video, and even the words from George Flloyd in that regards, he can't breathe. But we still see it even in the security sector, the headlocks and those types of maneuvers that are made, and that's how people really get hurt, or the head injuries from that as well. You choke someone out and then let them drop, and their head hits the ground and they suffer an aneurysm. So there's a range of different techniques that police security need to be aware of and should be aware of, and there is no real excuse other than in a situation of defence, where you're defending yourself in a live situation. But there was nowhere near that for that.
No, Christy, I think you touch on something important there. Training is often put up as the answer to these things, but when you see a police officer who intentionally does that, training is not going to fix that. What you see is a lack of humanity and a criminal act. You can't be trained out of lacking humanity, in my view. So, and also, it's not just a matter of training, because these tactics are so differentially applied depending on what race you are. There's no doubt about that in my mind. You asked before, what's the solution? We can see that there is a problem, and many people would agree to that. Well, in the US, they've got the George Floyd Justice in Policing Bill or Act before their parliament, and that would ban chokeholds, would ban no-knock raids, which we call forced entry raids here, put restrictions on militarisation, and importantly, end what's called qualified immunity, where individuals can't sue the police. And better data collection around issues to do with police misconduct and violence. There is no one solution. And you talked about the state system here and the federal system, and if that was an impediment to change. I think what's the real impediment to change is not acknowledging there's a problem to begin with, not listening to Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander people, First Nations people, secondly, and not acting. So 30 years since the Royal Commission made its more than 300 recommendations. It took Victoria something like 29 years to implement decriminalising public drunkenness. And some of the Aboriginal deaths in custody or killings would have been prevented had that been implemented earlier. In the US, Joe Biden, the president, he met with the family of George Floyd and spoke to them before and after the verdict. In Australia, Aboriginal families of men who've died in custody, men and women who've died in custody, are begging and have been asking to meet with the Prime Minister for a long time. There's a petition going round about that, and it has been for some time. He won't meet with them. And
it does sound a lot. I come back to the lack of leadership, though.
Yes, and Joe Biden has talked about systemic racism in policing, what that does and what it means for people of colour and African Americans, how they live in fear and how it's a stain on the country. He also talked about that in his first address to Congress, which I think was yesterday or the day before. In the face of the Black Lives Matter protest in Australia, our Prime Minister said, there's no problem here, it's a fair country. He denied the history of slavery. There's also a history of slavery here, not the same as in the US, but there is a history of slavery and, of course, massacres. So you've got to acknowledge that problem. There also needs to be leadership in policing. When the police chief in New South Wales says, when a police officer's caught on smart camera phone, pushing, throwing, slamming a 16-year-old Indigenous boy into the pavement, says, well, the police officer was having a bad day, then we know we've got a problem in leadership in this country. And one of the things that happened in the George Floyd trial, or the Derek Chauvin trial, of course, George Floyd wasn't on trial, was fellow police officers gave were witnesses against Derek Chauvin. That's very unusual. And they have a black chief police officer who gave evidence, who in his time in policing in Minneapolis had been highly critical of the racism in policing. So that's the type of leadership and the sort of change to culture that we need here. And we need the implementation 30 years on of those Royal Commission recommendations in every single state.
Yeah, look, I would definitely advocate for that. For the fact that it hasn't happened is a red flag, I think, to everybody. There's a couple of things here. One is I wanted to touch on body-worn cameras and the importance of those. And then the other one was, you know, the community approach. This isn't just a policing issue. Policing, as you said, reflects a broader societal issue. It's something I suppose, looking back in my days of, it does become an us and them. When you're dealing with local community, they hate the police. You got to go in there and solve a whole bunch of non-policing issues. It might be, you know, mental health. There's other sort of issues going on in that community that you have to deal with, because policing is that kind of service. It's on the front line, but it's housing, it's education. You know, it's a societal approach from the bottom up as well. You know, and I was born in the Pilbara, and you know, you look at a town like Newman, and they're at times in crisis, and it's not a policing issue. This is a societal community issue, and it's again long-term. This is a 200, 300-year history of change. So again, it's one of those things of, and I know from a policing perspective to be like, well, hang on, you know, we're just doing our best, we're just doing our job, and it's tough out there. And that's why they do band together, because you do have a sense of us and them. Policing can also deal with, you get overexposed to the negative side of a community. You know, you're not dealing with the nice people and the good people, because you don't have to, but you end up having to just deal. And so that change over time can occur. Was one of the reasons I got out, because I just did not want to go back onto the front line once I became a detective. And you kind of, you know, I was at homicide, so you kind of, that's almost the good part of the job. It's being on the front line and on the street is not a good place to be, certainly not for long periods of time. So there's that aspect. The operational challenges, just being a police officer on the street, is a real challenge, and whether they get that support. And then the link to that back to broader issues of society and what the government does. There's no question there. It's more my observation and the importance of broader community leadership as well, not just on policing.
No, I agree with you. You started off with the issue of body-worn cameras, and I think that's important. What people are saying, have said in the case of George Flloyd and the trial of Derek Chauvin, is that it wasn't justice. It was a step towards justice, but it was a degree of accountability, because police usually act with impunity when they use excessive force or lethal force, particularly against minority communities and particularly against Black and coloured people. So the body-worn cameras potentially could be something that promised accountability. But the problem with them, the body-worn cameras, is the police control the footage often. They won't release it, and there's been some court cases recently in Australia, and they're not obliged to, for example, in a civil action, release the body-worn camera footage. The thing that made the difference, and is making the difference, and has been making the difference since the 1990s, is the change in technology and the availability of smartphones. So apart from
general CCTV as well in the streets.
Exactly. But particularly the smartphone footage, the police and authorities do not have control over the release of that. If that very brave, at the time, 17-year-old girl hadn't taken that 10-minute footage of the incident, the murder of George Flloyd, there never would have been a trial, in my view. It would have been seen as a medical incident. So that's the difference between people having control of the technology and the police having the control of the technology. You talked about policing not being the answer and policing being a hard job, particularly for frontline police. I absolutely agree. And with law and order politics, with the politics of fear, with the dog whistling around racism, the idea that Black Australians and Americans are criminal because they're criminalised often. There has been an enormous pouring of resources into policing, and there's been the hollowing out or the undermining of a whole lot of other services that would be more appropriate, like mental health services, like health services. So I guess there's two aspects to this. There's alternatives to policing, so ensuring that there's proper health services, ensuring that people get access to a good education and an income that they can live on, meaningful employment, purpose in life,
no alcohol,
rehabilitation, all those things. And apart from alternatives to policing, which is sort of covered quite starkly and most sharply with the slogan defund the police and reinvest the money elsewhere, there's also alternative modes of policing. So policing can be on a spectrum, it can be militarised or it can be really community-based. And we know in Australia and from the US and places that these things have been implemented, justice reinvestment, as it's sometimes called, putting money that might have gone into policing into other services works, and also alternative modes of policing, for example, in Australian Indigenous communities having self-determination in the way things are policed, because First Nations people won't say there's no problems in their community. They won't say they don't need support and help, including from the police. But what they want is a response that's culturally sensitive and that's not counterproductive. So I know.
Yeah, I think that, well, there's always two. I mean, I've been on the record sort of supporting sort of semi-automatics at the airport in terms of the patrolling at an airport, in terms of critical infrastructure, the signal that sends to potential criminals in that environment. And then in contrast to mention Newman, or you got it in North Queensland and throughout the Kimberley region, often it's alcohol-related violence, antisocial behaviour. That's a different model. And I think, do you think they're being creative and sort of risk averse to new models? I mean, they're trying, all I can see at the moment is the welfare card or something like that, but there's no other real community models that I see at a local level that the community's trying to make changes or implement new models that, you know, might not work, but at least they're trying. Are you seeing anything like that in terms of the research as well, of what might work? Is it just that local community taking that leadership role and almost doing away with maybe a traditional criminal justice system that might be operating in the state, but just saying, look, we want our own legal system and we need to sort of take it out of a criminal justice system? What's your thoughts there?
Well, I believe that there are successful programs, and Burke is often pointed to in New South Wales as an example of a successful Indigenous-led, you know, alternative modes of policing and alternatives to policing. And I think it's important to listen to Indigenous people and give self-determination. That's where the solutions will come from. And you'd have to say we're not doing very well at the moment. So it's time to, and people say where there are good programs, they tend to be pilots, and then the funding's not continuous. So I think, and look, I think what people say is, look, we know what works. It just needs to be funded. And we need to work with local communities. We know what doesn't work, and we're doing that.
Yeah, I think, look, I do agree with that, is we know what doesn't work, but we keep doing it expecting different results, which is, as they say, a sign of madness. But it is definitely what we do. And I know the good intentions are there often, even at a political level, where they would love to make those changes, or they do try. I do also know from a policing perspective, they wish they didn't. If there was an alternative, or they were told you don't have to do that anymore, and we've got an alternative, I'm sure most police would go, great, do it, because operational police don't have that decision to make. And I think the other thing is at the commissioner level versus to the police ministers, and then through to the justice system, that's where the change needs to make, because the police commissioner is legislated to do that work. He doesn't have the choice. So it comes back to the police minister and the government of the day to make those changes, and there's no point doing it out of pocket. You've got to do it nationally. Yeah,
the chief commissioners, I'll say she, because there are some she chief commissioners. In any hierarchical organisation, the police is highly hierarchical, as you say. Leadership is so important in terms of change, whether it be cultural or whether it be structural. So we need political leadership. We need leadership in policing. And there has been examples of good leadership.
Yeah. Look, as we said, it happens in pockets, and I think that's the problem. So this session was really focused on the outcomes of the Chauvin trial and the impacts on policing. As Jude's mentioned, there's been sort of legislative change in the US in terms of police tactics and things like chokeholds and those types of things. And are you hearing noise here in Australia, Jude, in terms of making those similar changes here, or do you think over time may well occur?
Well, I think what needs to happen here is, at bottom line, the Royal Commission's recommendations need to be implemented in full. There's groups of Indigenous organisations working on Close the Justice Gap, and their voice needs to be heard.
Okay, and the other one I would suggest is body-worn cameras, even though there's problems around those, but I think the broader they are, the key word's accountability. From a policing perspective, if you're accountable, that'll always be in your back of your mind. And I'm kind of glad there weren't as many cameras around in my day as well. It's like, times have changed, and not all good, or not all for the good, unfortunately, as well. So look, Jude McCulloch, the Emeritus Professor of Criminology, Faculty of Arts, Monash University, absolute pleasure. And I think we'll monitor this over the time, Jude. It's one of those things of, I call myself an optimistic pessimist. So my view is things won't change, and we could be here in another 20, 30 years and no doubt probably talking about the same thing, but I hope I'm wrong. But I don't have a lot of faith, to be honest, in the way things work.
Well, the Chauvin verdict was historic, was emotional, and it was said to be a beacon of hope. So I'd like to be hopeful without suggesting there isn't a lot of change that's still necessary, both here and in the US. But thank you for your time, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely, Jude. And I'll let you go. Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.
Ciao. Okay, I'll let you go back to backstage. And thank you to Jude, and thank you to the audience there and some of the comments. And thank you to Katie as well. Look, it's not the best topic, but it's certainly an interesting one and broad ranging in terms of impacts and opportunities there for here in Australia, and also obviously in the US, and we mentioned the UK also. As I do, I'll close off with the report of the day, and the Robert Half. Yeah, Robert Half, their salary guide 2021 just came out, and really showing now 79% of Australian leaders say hybrid workforces are comprised of employees working remotely in an office, and now a permanent part of the employment landscape. We kind of knew that already, but it's getting locked down in terms of these reports and studies. Remuneration trends. Employees still plan to award salary increases. This is probably a good thing. That's 31% yes for all employees in terms of, do you plan to increase salaries for existing employees in 2021? The average salary increase company leaders plan to give in 2021 is 6%. So that's not too bad. And yes, but only for top performers is 38%. So you've got at least nearly 70% there in terms of a raise in for all employees or for top performers. And no, was it 22% were no, and then 9%. So about 30% is either a no or not sure. So if you're working for one of those employers, you're not getting a raise. And in terms of in-demand technical skills, and this is available obviously on the MySecurity Marketplace, so you can check this out for a download. But the in-demand, the top one there is software and web development, and then business intelligence and reporting, and then in-demand soft skills, logical problem solving and communication skills, and innovative thinking. New Zealand, top 5 permanent roles, software developer, tester, and product manager, and top 5 contract roles, software developer, tester, and systems engineer. And then in Australia, we've got help desk support officer is the top 5, then systems and security engineers, and then the top 5 contract roles, help desk support officers. I think it's probably because they're bringing all the help desk back to Australia for a bit of a sovereignty play, and then the systems engineer and software developers. So if you are a software developer, you are in hot demand according to the Robert Half Salary Guide 2021. You should probably be asking for a pay rise. Please check out the Cyber Risk Leaders magazine and our Cyber War series. And now that's it from us for a couple of weeks. I'm going to take a few weeks break. We might do the odd interview, and we do have some other podcasts and MySecTV interviews coming through, but they won't be live. So in terms of the live streaming, I may stream from Perth. I'm off to WA for a good couple of weeks, and we'll see how we go. But certainly next week, we're going to take a break. We'll be back to live streaming in late May. So thank you very much for joining us on our Tech and Sec Weekly Friday morning episode, and enjoy your Friday and your weekend.